Stay on your own side of the line, peasant. This table is for winners.
The world froze when Brandon Thorne picked up that plate. Stay on your own side of the line, peasant, he sneered, his voice slicing through the cafeteria's low hum. This table is for winners. Then he turned and dumped the entire serving of mashed potatoes and gravy onto Ethan Vance's head. It cascaded down Ethan's face, thick and slow, soaking his plain shirt, pooling in his lap. Vance Academy's elite cafeteria went utterly silent. Every conversation died. Phones lifted, screens glowing, recording the spectacle. Brandon had no idea he'd just obliterated his entire future. The quiet student sitting there, gravy dripping from his chin, wasn't some nobody. He was the one person on earth who could strip Brandon of his scholarship, his reputation, his path to the Ivy League. Instantly. Have you ever seen someone's entitlement cost them absolutely everything? Let's rewind 12 hours to understand how we got here. It began with arrogance. Brandon Thorne moved through Vance Academy like he owned the hallways. And in many ways, he did. His family's name was etched on half the buildings, their donations quieting any complaint. That morning, he'd shoved a freshman out of his path, mocked a teacher's outdated jacket, all while dreaming of the early acceptance letter from Stanford that would cement his reign. His goal was clear: dominate, humiliate, and rise untouched. Then he saw Ethan Vance, quiet, watchful, seated alone with a book, and something about Ethan's calmness felt like a challenge. By lunch, the cafeteria was packed, a sea of blazers and ambition. Brandon held court at the central table, surrounded by laughter that was a little too loud. And then Ethan did the unthinkable. He took a seat just one table over, close enough to blur the invisible lines Brandon had drawn. Brandon stood up, wine glass in hand from the teacher's lounge event earlier, and strolled over. The charity cases usually eat in the courtyard, he announced, voice carrying. This section's for legacy families. You're embarrassing yourself. Ethan just looked up, eyes steady, unblinking. That silence infuriated Brandon more than any retort. So he reached for the nearest plate, mashed potatoes, gravy, peas, and raised it high. Let me make this clear for you. The room watched, breath held. Then the food flew. It happened in a slow-motion splash. The plate clattered, gravy dripped, and Ethan didn't flinch. He took a napkin, wiped the mess from his eyes with slow, deliberate motions, then looked straight at Brandon. Not with anger, not with shame, with a cold, profound look of clinical disappointment. He whispered one word, so soft only Brandon caught it: assessment. In that moment, something icy trickled down Brandon's spine. Then the phones came out. The hashtag was born. Hashtag cafeteria cruelty. By the time Brandon walked out, smirking, the video was already spreading. A digital wildfire he didn't know would burn his world to the ground. If you've ever felt the sting of injustice, or watched someone abuse their power without consequence, you're not alone. This is a story about the moment the world tips back toward balance. And I'm telling it for you. Subscribe now. Join a community of readers who believe in accountability, in second chances, in stories where the right side wins. Let's watch this unfold together. Drop a comment below with the word karma. If you've been waiting for a story like this, I read every single one. Welcome to the family. Ground. He walked on it like he owned it. The polished marble floors of Vance Academy's main corridor reflected Brandon Thorne's confident stride. A king surveying his kingdom before the first bell. It was a kingdom built on whispers and weighted silences, on the understanding that the Thorne family's name and their money papered over every crack. Brandon's goal was simple, etched into his daily routine as clearly as the family crest on his blazer pocket. Dominate, demoralize, and secure the early acceptance scholarship to Stanford that would be his crown. Everything else was just maintenance. He passed a cluster of freshmen, their laughter dying instantly as his shadow fell over them. One, a small boy with glasses, fumbled his stack of books. Brandon didn't break stride. His shoulder caught the boy, sending the books scattering across the floor with a sharp clatter. "Watch your step, charity case," Brandon muttered. The insult tossed over his shoulder like confetti. The boy scrambled, face burning. No teacher intervened. They never did. They'd look away, busying themselves with papers, a silent pact to tolerate the thorn in their side for the sake of the thorn endowment. And that's when Brandon first saw him, Ethan Vance, sitting alone on a stone bench in the courtyard annex, a book open on his lap, completely still. He wasn't reading. He was watching. His eyes tracked Brandon's procession of petty cruelty with a calm, unnerving focus. He didn't look angry or afraid. He looked analytical, like he was taking notes. Brandon felt a flicker of irritation. Who was this quiet, unassuming scholarship student to observe him? He wore plain clothes, carried a second-hand backpack, and moved through the halls like a ghost. A nobody. Yet, something about that steady gaze felt like a challenge to the invisible hierarchy Brandon had spent years building. Later, in advanced economics, Brandon caught Ethan watching him again. Mr. Davies was droning on about market forces, but Brandon was fixated on the reflection in the window. Ethan's eyes were on him, cool and assessing. It wasn't the sycophantic admiration Brandon was used to. It was evaluation. Disrespect, Brandon decided. Pure, simple disrespect from someone who didn't know his place. The anger was a slow burn in his chest. This scholarship leech, this quiet observer, was a flaw in his perfect world. A flaw that needed to be corrected publicly to remind everyone, including Ethan Vance, exactly who ruled Vance Academy. The plan began to form over lunch period, a cruel idea taking shape with every arrogant beat of his heart. But Brandon had no idea the quiet student was observing far more than just a bully. He was conducting a final exam, and Brandon was about to fail spectacularly. The question was, what would the penalty be? It was the only thing Brandon Thorne demanded of the world, to simply be as he dictated. The morning sun through the leaded glass windows of Vance Academy painted long, judgmental stripes across the hallway as Brandon continued his reign. His deep flaw wasn't just cruelty. It was the absolute, unshakable belief that his actions had no real consequence. The Thorne name was a shield, the family donations a sword, and he wielded both with the carelessness of a god. He cornered a kitchen staff member, an older woman refilling the coffee station. "This is lukewarm," Brandon stated, pushing his cup toward her. "Do I look like I drink swill? Make it again. Properly." His voice was a quiet whip, meant to humiliate, not just instruct. The woman's hands shook slightly as she took the cup, her eyes downcast. A passing teacher, Ms. Gibbons, paused, a conflict flashing behind her eyes. Duty versus discretion. She chose discretion, walking faster, her heels clicking a retreat on the marble. Brandon smirked. "See? No consequences. Only power." But the quiet observer saw it all. Ethan Vance was a shadow in the periphery, a silent witness to every sneer, every calculated meanness. He stood by his locker as Brandon, accidentally, tripped a sophomore, sending the boy's tablet skidding across the floor, the screen cracking with a sickening sound. Brandon didn't even glance back, just laughed with his friends. Ethan's expression didn't change. He didn't rush to help. He just watched. And this, more than anything, became a burr under Brandon's skin. This silent, calm observation felt like a verdict being written in real time. In the library period, Brandon finally confronted the source of his irritation. He found Ethan at a corner corral, writing in a plain notebook. Not notes for class. It looked like a journal. Brandon loomed over the desk, blocking the light. "What's this?" he asked, his voice dripping with false curiosity. "A diary? Writing about your desperate crush on someone who'll never look at you." He reached for the notebook. Ethan's hand came down on the cover, not with a slam, but with a firm, final pressure. He looked up, not with fear, but with a weary patience that was infinitely more insulting. "It's private," Ethan said, his voice low and even. "Nothing's private here if I'm interested." Brandon shot back, leaning in. "What's the matter, Vance? Scholarship not cover a sense of humor? Or are you just boring?" He was searching for a reaction. Anger, tears, submission. Anything to crack that infuriating calm. Ethan merely closed the notebook and slid it into his backpack. "I'm observing," he said simply, as if that explained everything. Then he stood, shouldered his bag, and walked away, leaving Brandon standing there, humiliated by the sheer lack of engagement. The fury that bloomed in Brandon's chest was white-hot and blinding. This quiet, watchful student had just dismissed him, had walked away from him. In Brandon's world, that was an act of war. The minor ridicule had failed. It was time for a major public correction. The stage was set. The audience would be assembled by lunchtime. But as Brandon stewed, a cold, logical part of his mind, buried deep under layers of entitlement, whispered a warning. Why was he so calm? What was in that notebook? The questions vanished as quickly as they came, drowned out by the roaring need to put Ethan Vance in his place, once and for all. The countdown to the cafeteria had begun, and Brandon was too blinded by rage to see he was marching toward his own ruin. It started, as so many catastrophes do, with a simple act of defiance. The lunch bell screamed, and the hallways of Vance Academy became a river of blazers flowing toward the cavernous dining hall. A temple of social stratification disguised with stained oak and crystal light fixtures. Brandon held court at the central, round table, the unofficial throne room. His inner circle laughed too loudly at his jokes, their eyes darting to ensure they were laughing at the right moments. The air smelled of expensive herbal chicken and unearned privilege. And then he saw it. Ethan Vance, tray in hand, did not drift toward the distant tables by the windows, the usual exile for scholarship students and the socially invisible. Instead, he moved with a quiet purpose and took a seat at a small, two-person table just one empty table away from Brandon's inner circle. It wasn't at the royal table itself, but it was close enough to blur the lines. Close enough to be a statement. A direct challenge to the unspoken map of the cafeteria that Brandon had drawn in everyone's minds. The conversation at Brandon's table stuttered. Eyes flicked from Brandon to Ethan and back. The challenge hung in the air, silent and profound. Brandon felt the eyes of his kingdom upon him. His authority, meticulously constructed over years, was being tested by the one person who had shown him nothing but calm indifference. The irritation from the library curdled into cold, pure rage. This would not stand. He needed a spectacle. He stood up slowly, deliberately, picking up the half-finished glass of sparkling grape juice from a teacher's event that sat on their table. A prop that looked enough like wine to suit his drama. The room's noise began to dampen, sensing a performance. He walked the 10 paces to Ethan's table, his shoes clicking a slow, menacing rhythm on the floor. Ethan didn't look up from his book until Brandon's shadow fell across the page. "The charity cases usually eat in the courtyard," Brandon announced, his voice loud enough to carry to every corner of the now hushed cafeteria. He held the glass loosely, swirling the dark liquid. "Or at the tables by the dumpsters. I hear the ambience is more fitting." A few sycophantic snickers echoed from his table. "This section," Brandon continued, leaning in, "is for families who've actually built this school, who understand legacy. You're embarrassing yourself. Move." Ethan finally looked up. He closed his book, set it aside, and met Brandon's gaze. There was no anger there, no fear, just that same deep observation. He said nothing. The silence was more insulting than any retort. "I said move," Brandon repeated, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "Or do I need to make the message clearer?" He glanced at his own table, at the plates of food. The mashed potatoes were thick, the gravy a dark, rich brown. The perfect tools for a lesson. The tension in the room was a live wire, humming, waiting for a spark. Every student was frozen, phones subtly shifting in pockets. Ready. Brandon had the audience he wanted. He had the target. All he needed now was the final, irreversible act. He looked back at Ethan's calm, unreadable face and made his decision. The point of no contradiction was here, now in this terrible public silence. And he was going to cross it with a splash. It wasn't a throw, not really. It was a pouring. A deliberate, slow tipping of the plate so everyone could see the gravity of the act. Brandon reached back to his table without looking, his hand closing around the edge of a full plate. Mashed potatoes, a lake of gravy, green peas like little scattered islands. He raised it, a grotesque offering. "Let me translate for you, since you clearly don't understand our language," he said, his voice echoing in the pin-drop silence. Then he turned his wrist. The world seemed to slow. The glop of food left the plate in a single heavy mass. It hit Ethan Vance square in the face and chest with a wet, sickening smack. Gravy splattered in a radial pattern. Potatoes clung to his hair. Peas rolled down his front and onto the floor, the tiny tink-tink-tink of their landing absurdly loud. The ceramic plate clattered, spun, and settled on the tile. Absolute silence, deeper than before. 100 breaths held. Then movement. Ethan did not scream. He did not flinch or leap up. He sat there for 3 full heartbeats, food streaming down his face. Then, with a calm so profound it was terrifying, he reached for the clean napkin beside his untouched tray. He unfolded it slowly. He brought it to his face and wiped his eyes first, clearing his vision with meticulous care. He blotted his cheeks, his chin. The room watched, hypnotized by this quiet, methodical cleanup of a public atrocity. Finally, he lowered the soiled napkin and looked directly at Brandon. Not with hatred, not with tears, but with a cold, profound look of clinical disappointment, the way a scientist might look at a failed experiment. He leaned forward, just slightly, and whispered a single word so soft that only Brandon, standing frozen 2 feet away, could hear it. Assessment. The word hung in the air between them, icy and final. It meant nothing to Brandon in that moment, and yet it chilled him to his core. It sounded like a sentence. And then the spell broke. A phone camera shutter clicked, an actual sound in the digital age, someone forgetting to mute it. It was the starter's pistol. A dozen other phones rose, recording the gravy-streaked victim, the stunned bully, the silent courtroom of their peers. Brandon's defiant smirk returned, a weak mask over his sudden, creeping unease. He'd won, hadn't he? He'd put the nobody in his place. He turned and walked back to his table, his friends patting his back with hesitant, nervous hands. But the buzz in the room wasn't admiration. It was the electric hum of something being shared, uploaded, broadcast. By the time Brandon sat down, the first post was live. The hashtag, born from a mixture of horror and schadenfreude, was already trending within the school's firewall. Hashtag cafeteria cruelty. The video was clean, clear, and damning. It captured everything. The sneer, the pour, the cold, whispered verdict. Brandon had wanted a public lesson. He'd just given one to the entire world. And that single mysterious word, assessment, echoed in the now chattering cafeteria, a seed of dread taking root in Brandon's gut. What exactly had he just been graded on? The grade was being written in real time, not by a teacher, but by the relentless court of public opinion. Brandon sat at his table, the backpats feeling hollow, the laughter of his friends forced. He pulled out his own phone, a sleek, black slab of arrogance. His notifications were already blowing up, not with concern but with tags. Hashtag cafeteria cruelty. The video had escaped the school's network. It was on public social feeds, copied, reposted, commented on. The view count was a digital clock ticking upward at a terrifying speed. He saw the comments scrolling like a river of venom. Disgusting. Who does this kid think he is? Expel him. But nestled among the outrage were the first whispers of real danger. A user with an alumni tag commented, "Is that the Thorn kid? His father is a major donor. This is embarrassing for Vance." Another replied, "Donor or not, this is a lawsuit waiting to happen. Who's the victim?" Brandon's defiance, stoked by fear, flared. They didn't understand. His family was Vance Academy. This would blow over. It had to. He opened his own feed, his thumbs flying over the screen. He crafted a post, not an apology, but a boast, a doubling down. He quoted the video and wrote, "Some people need to learn their place. Clean up on aisle 9. Hashtag no regrets, hashtag Thorn legacy." He tagged the school's official account for good measure. He hit post. The immediate reaction was a torrent of fresh fury, but also a handful of laughing emojis from his sycophantic circle. Felt like reclaiming control. He was Brandon Thorn. He was untouchable. But in a quiet study corral on the 3rd floor, far from the cafeteria's lingering shock, Ethan Vance watched the digital fallout unfold on a tablet. He saw Brandon's boastful post. A faint, almost imperceptible sigh escaped him. He opened a secure, encrypted messaging app and typed a brief message to a contact saved as AV. Phase 1 complete. Social proof acquired. Target's response is textbook. Proceeding to Phase 2. He hit send. 30 seconds later, his phone buzzed with a reply. A single word, accelerated. Downstairs, Brandon's phone rang. It was his father. The call connected, and before Brandon could utter a word, Mr. Thorne's voice, usually so composed, was a tight wire of panic. "Brandon, what in God's name have you done? I'm getting calls. The board is calling. They're saying it's about the founder's son." The line crackled with his father's frantic breathing. "They want you in the headmaster's office. Now, don't say another word to anyone. Do you understand me? Not a word." The call ended. The blood drained from Brandon's face, leaving him cold and waxy. The cafeteria noise faded into a distant roar. Founder's son? What was his father talking about? He looked across the room, to where the janitor was now quietly mopping up the last of the gravy and peas from the floor. The empty table where Ethan had sat seemed to accuse him. The whispered word came back, louder now, a drumbeat in his skull. Assessment, assessment, assessment. A terrible, dizzying realization began to dawn. He hadn't been bullying a nobody. He'd been performing. And the quiet, watchful student hadn't just been a victim. He'd been the critic. But who was he reviewing the performance for? The answer was waiting in the headmaster's office, and the walk there felt like the longest of Brandon's life. It was about to be dismantled piece by precious piece. The walk to the headmaster's office was a death march through a gauntlet of stairs. Whispers followed Brandon like ghosts. "That's him. Hashtag cafeteria cruelty." The once fearful gazes now held a new emotion. A hungry, anticipatory curiosity. They were waiting for the fall. The headmaster's secretary, Ms. Greeley, didn't smile. She didn't offer her usual, "Hello, Brandon." Her face was pale, her lips a thin, bloodless line. "Go right in," she said, her voice flat. "They're waiting for you." The word, "they" landed with a weight that made Brandon's stomach lurch. He pushed the heavy oak door open. The room was oppressively warm, smelling of old books and dread. Headmaster Riggs wasn't behind his imposing desk. He was standing stiffly by the window, his back to the room. And there, seated in a high-backed leather chair usually reserved for trustees, was Ethan Vance. He had changed his shirt, but a faint, watermarked stain was still visible on the collar. His face was clean, composed. He held a simple file folder on his lap. He didn't look at Brandon. "Sit down, Thorne," Headmaster Riggs said without turning. His voice was hollow. Brandon sat in the hard, wooden chair meant for students in trouble. The silence stretched, broken only by the frantic buzzing of his phone in his pocket. His father, no doubt. He didn't dare answer it. Finally, Riggs turned. The man looked 10 years older. His eyes were red-rimmed, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted his tie. "Your father is on his way," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He has just been on a conference call with the chairman of the board and the founder's family legal counsel." "Founder," Brandon croaked, the word sticking in his dry throat. "Mr. Vance? What does this have to do with him?" His eyes flicked to Ethan, who was now calmly opening the file folder. "Everything?" a new voice said, crisp and clear, emanating from the large monitor on the wall that had suddenly flickered to life. The screen showed a man in his late 50s, with sharp, intelligent eyes and steel-gray hair, seated in a sleek, modern office. Arthur Vance, the reclusive billionaire who had built the academy from the ground up, whose name was on the building, whose principles were quoted in the school handbook. His face was a mask of cold fury. "It has everything to do with me, young man," Arthur Vance said, his gaze locking onto Brandon through the screen. "Because the student you assaulted today for your own amusement is my son." The world tilted. The air vanished from the room. Brandon's brain scrambled, rejected the information, then was forced to accept it in a nauseating wave. Ethan Vance. The last name wasn't a coincidence. It was a secret, a hidden truth. The scholarship student, the quiet observer, the charity case, was the prince of the entire kingdom. And Brandon had just thrown food in the prince's face on live television. The clinical disappointment in Ethan's eyes now made horrifying, perfect sense. It wasn't just a victim's look. It was an owner's judgment. Brandon had been the subject of a private cultural assessment all along, and he had just delivered a failing grade on himself. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The shield of his family name shattered into a million useless pieces. The founder was here, and he was not pleased. Arthur Vance was the opposite of pleased. His digital presence in the headmaster's office was more imposing than any physical being. "Let me be perfectly clear," he continued, his voice devoid of any warmth, cutting through Brandon's stunned silence. Vance Academy was founded on principles of merit, integrity, and respect. It was not built to be a safe haven for cruelty, entitlement, and the toxic preservation of social hierarchy. His eyes shifted to the headmaster, who seemed to shrink under the gaze. "Headmaster Riggs, the institutional failure here is profound. You have tolerated a culture where this—" He gestured toward Brandon, a flick of his hand as if brushing away refuse. "Could not only exist, but thrive." The office door burst open. Mr. Thorne stood there, face flushed, tie askew. "Arthur, please, let's talk about this," he began, his voice a blend of panic and forced charm. "We are done talking, Charles," Arthur Vance interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. "The board has convened electronically. The vote is unanimous. The recommendations are as follows." He looked back at his son. "Ethan, the report." Ethan Vance stood. He didn't look at his father on the screen or at the trembling headmaster. He looked directly at Brandon's father, Mr. Thorne, and then at Brandon. He opened the file folder. His voice, when he spoke, was calm, clear, and carried the full, devastating weight of his father's authority. Based on a semester-long observational assessment of Vance Academy's social culture, with today's incident serving as the culminating evidence, I find a deeply embedded pattern of systemic bullying enabled by institutional passivity. The primary agent of this toxicity is Brandon Thorne. He read coolly, listing incidents, times, witnesses. Many pulled from his quiet notebook. The tripped freshman, the harassed staff member, the library confrontation, each one a nail. Brandon felt his future slipping away with every word. Ethan finished and looked at his father. Arthur Vance gave a single grim nod. Therefore, Arthur announced, "The following actions are effective immediately. 1. Brandon Thorne is expelled from Vance Academy. His expulsion is to be announced to the student body before dismissal today. 2. All college recommendation letters from this institution in his name are hereby retracted and voided. 3. The Dean of Students is relieved of her duties for her documented inaction in the face of repeated behavioral reports. And 4, he said, his eyes locking now with Mr. Thorne's, the Thorne family's standing on the board of advisors is suspended indefinitely. Your financial contributions, while previously appreciated, do not purchase immunity from basic human decency." Mr. Thorne sank into a vacant chair as if his legs had given out. Brandon just stared, numb. Expelled. Recommendations gone. His golden ticket to Stanford revoked. The legacy destroyed. It had taken less than an hour. All because of a plate of mashed potatoes and the quiet, watchful son of the one man whose principle outweighed any donation. Arthur Vance's final words were not a shout, but they echoed in the tomb-silent room. "My school will be cleansed of this poison. Starting now." The screen went black. The verdict was delivered. But the execution of the sentence, the public humiliation, and the institutional purge was just beginning. And Brandon was about to learn what it felt like to be on the other side of the spectacle. It was Brandon's turn to be one. The news of his expulsion traveled through the school faster than the viral video. By the time the final bell rang, an announcement was made over the PA system. A dry, formal statement that confirmed every shocking rumor. The headmaster's voice, shaky and defeated, filled every classroom. Brandon Thorne is no longer a student at Vance Academy, effective immediately. But the true spectacle was the walk. 2 stern-faced members of the board's security team, not the usual campus monitors, appeared at the door of his last class. "Mr. Thorne, you will accompany us to collect your belongings and vacate the premises." Their tone brooked no argument. The entire class watched, phones discreetly recording once more, as Brandon was escorted into the hallway. This time, he was the one with food on his face, the invisible stain of shame. They walked him through the main corridor, a perverse reversal of his morning strut. Students lined the halls, not cheering, not jeering, just watching. Their silence was 1,000 times worse than any noise. He saw the freshman he'd tripped now standing straight. He saw the kitchen staff member, a small, hard smile on her lips. He saw the members of his own inner circle, their eyes darting away, already disassociating, rewriting their social maps to exclude the fallen king. At his locker, he was given 5 minutes to empty it under supervision. As he shoved books into a duffel bag, he overheard 2 teachers talking in low, urgent tones nearby. "The dean's office is already cleared out. Arthur Vance is flying in personally tomorrow. He's established an anonymous tip line for reporting bullying, with direct oversight from his legal team." His father was waiting by the main entrance, face like stone. As they stepped out into the afternoon sun, a black town car pulled up. Not their usual luxury sedan, but something hired, impersonal. Before they could get in, Mr. Thorne's phone rang. He listened, his face growing grayer by the second. They can't do that," he hissed into the phone. "Our donations are contractual." He listened again, then slumped against the car. He's matched our annual donation for the next 10 years, from his personal foundation, to ensure the policy changes are permanent and untainted. The final pillar of their influence crumbled. Money, their ultimate weapon, had been not just neutralized but turned against them. Arthur Vance wasn't just expelling a student. He was performing surgery on the institution itself, cutting out the rot with a ruthless, principled hand. The Thorne legacy at Vance Academy was over, replaced by a massive, public donation that would forever be associated with their disgrace. As the town car pulled away from the curb, Brandon looked back at the grand stone facade of the school. He didn't see his kingdom anymore. He saw a fortress that had ejected him, its gates now permanently closed. The purge was complete for him. But inside those walls, a transformation was just beginning, and he was forever on the outside, looking in at the world he'd taken for granted, a world now forever out of reach. He would never reach those gates again, never walk those polished halls as anything but a cautionary tale. In the days that followed, Brandon Thorne existed in a numb limbo. The Ivy League letters stopped coming. The friends stopped calling. His father moved through their cavernous house like a ghost, speaking in hushed, tense phone calls about damage control and alternative paths. The silence at home was deafening, filled with the echo of a future that had violently vanished. Meanwhile, inside Vance Academy, a new sound emerged. The sound of change, firm and deliberate. Arthur Vance arrived, not with fanfare, but with a small army of consultants, child psychologists, and organizational behavior experts. He addressed the entire school in the same cafeteria where the incident had occurred. He stood where the gravy had been mopped away. His voice, amplified, held no rage, only a resolute, unshakable certainty. What happened here was not an isolated incident, he stated, his eyes scanning the faces of students and faculty alike. It was the symptom of a diseased culture. That culture ends today. He outlined the Vance Integrity Framework, a non-negotiable, zero-tolerance anti-bullying policy with clear, escalating consequences, independent of a student's last name or family contributions. An anonymous, externally monitored reporting system. Mandatory empathy and leadership workshops for every student, starting with the senior class. A complete review of faculty and administrative performance, with several early retirements announced within the week. The transformation was profound and swift. The whispered hierarchies dissolved. Students who had been quiet began to speak up in class. Teachers, empowered and held accountable, started enforcing rules uniformly. The social currency shifted from fear and family wealth to respect and merit. The school didn't just become stricter, it became healthier. The oppressive, watchful tension was replaced by a lighter, more genuine atmosphere. The campus, once a beautiful but cold stage for social drama, began to feel like a place of learning again. For Brandon, watching the school's social media feeds from his isolation was a special kind of torture. He saw posts about the new community mentorship program. He saw photos of the quiet freshman he'd tripped now leading a robotics team. He saw Ethan Vance, no longer hiding, but not seeking the spotlight either, participating normally, just another student, the extraordinary truth of his identity now simply a known fact that had catalyzed necessary change. The system had not just survived the scandal, it had been reforged into something stronger and better because of it. Brandon's cruel act had been the catalyst for a lasting, positive transformation. A legacy, but not the one he'd ever wanted. His own transformation was slower, darker, and internal. The uncontrollable entitlement was gone, burned away by public disgrace and consequence. In its place was a hollow understanding. He had not been special. He had been protected. And when true, principled authority had finally looked his way, that protection had vaporized. He was just a kid who'd been cruel, and the world had finally, decisively said no. The path forward was unclear, unpaved, and utterly merit-based for the first time in his life. He had wanted to rule a kingdom. Instead, he had been its sacrifice, the fallen idol that allowed a better institution to rise from the old, flawed foundations. The final, shocking twist wasn't about power or revenge. It was about healing. The poison was purged, the system transformed, and the quiet student's assessment was complete. The grade was final, and the lesson for everyone was forever.